is now being recorded.
I'd like to welcome you to the public comment webinar on standard AS/NZS4645 gas distribution networks. This standard has been extensively reviewed over the last couple of years and is currently open for public comment. There are three parts to the standard. Today we'll provide information about the changes to Part 1, and on Wednesday we'll provide information on Part 2, and Part 3 will be covered on Friday. These webinars are being recorded and will be available from our website, but we will send through the details of their location shortly. So I'd like to introduce your speaker for today, Philip Colvin. Philip is the Gas Network Asset Manager at Gemini. He has 30 years experience in utility businesses, initially in water supply and in the last 25 years in natural gas distribution and pipelines. His functions have spanned commercial, regulatory and technical roles. He's the chair of the Australian Standards Committee AG008 that oversees AS4645, as well as being a member on several of the gas pipeline standards committees. He is also a member of several industry technical and research committees. Philip is currently Gemini's asset manager for the gas distribution assets. He holds both engineering and business degrees. He's a fellow of Engineers Australia. Married with 4 young children, when time permits, he still likes to indulge in a little bit of sailing and from time to time completes the odd triathlon. He's an officer in the Army Reserve and a training member of the Volunteer Ski Patrol in New South Wales. I will now hand over to Phil, who will take you through the proposed changes to Part 1 of the standard. Phil, over to you.
Thank you, Dennis, and welcome to all. While I'm in doing thank yous, I'd also like to thank ENA for putting on this webinar. And additionally, before I also forget, a thank you to those on the committee and their nominating organisations. Without their effort and their critical thinking, we would not be able to have produced what we've got in front of you today. Over the next period of time, I will be providing information on both changes to ASNZS4645 Part 1, Gas Distribution Networks, Network Management, and also information as to the process of submitting public comments. I also draw your attention to the 2 webinars later in the week, one for Part 2 on Wednesday and one for Part 3 on Friday. The agenda covers the administration process for the public comment, the scope of a standard, some background to the revision and proposed improvements. Throughout the webinar, there are opportunities for questions. However, we probably will not be able to answer all of them. And what I do is draw you to the blue box on the screen. What we'll try and do is answer any background questions that might be there, provide simple clarifications if possible. If there's questions of more complex clarification, what we'll do is try and answer those by correspondence. But what I really do want to emphasise is that we would appreciate you lodge all of your comments by public comment through the public comment process, which I'll cover shortly. A quick introduction to the process for the development of Australian standards. First step in the process is actually project approval, whereby effectively a business case is put through to Standards Australia to justify the revision of a standard. In this case, the revision was put through over 2 years ago. And I'd like to thank firstly the Western Australian Technical Regulator who put in that revision that started the process. The revision, the business case covers the reasons for the revision and what the benefits of the revision may provide. Second step in the process is effectively the project setup, which is an administrative step provided by Standards Australia. The third step is having the draft written by the committee and then edited and prepared for public comment. We're approximately 2 years into the process as of now for this process. Next step is the public comment process, which we are now in for parts 1, 2 and 3. This is a 9-week period, and I'll draw your attention to some of those details for public comment in the next slide. Once public comment is completed, and barring there being any major issues, there is a ballot held by Standards Australia for the committee, in which the committee actually votes to pass the standard through to publication. Publication is after the final edit and standards is received the necessary approvals. As this is also a New Zealand standard, it has to go through approvals in New Zealand prior to publishing. We're aiming to publish in approximately Q3 of this calendar year. Some administrative points as to the public comment process. Firstly, please note that all 3 parts are out for public comment at the same time. As I've drawn your attention to before, there are 3 webinars covering each of these parts. Public comment will close on the 26th of April. And if you wish to make public comment, and I encourage you all to, drafts of the standards and the process for public comment can be found at the standards website, which is there on the screen. Down the bottom you can see a snapshot of the home page, and in the bottom right-hand corner there's a series of links that takes you through to all of those standards that are up for public comment and describes the process for public comment. As stated earlier, if there's any questions on the standards process, please feel free to email them through or lodge them. But the process is pretty well described on the standards site. Application. This standard specifies the requirements for safe, reliable and affordable management of gas distribution networks operating at less than or equal to 1050 kPa that reticulate gas to consumers. The requirements apply to the life cycle of the new gas distribution networks or new assets introduced where existing gas distribution networks are modified or augmented. The sections on operations, maintenance, repair, decommissioning, gas quality and risk assessments are suitable for application to existing assets or new assets in existing gas distribution networks. There is an exemption to the pressure limit for those gas distribution networks with an MAP greater than 1050, where this is allowed in New Zealand and by legislation in some states of Australia. As the slide indicates, the scope includes assets between the outlets of all city gates, supply points or their equivalent, or for an LP gas distribution network, the point of exit of the LP gas feeder main, and the outlet for consumers' meter assembly. There are several exemptions to this application that are noted in the standard, and I recommend that you actually have a look at that section. There are a fair wide range of stakeholders who may use this standard. Up there is the general list that we use. In particular, the owners, operators and the technical regulators are key stakeholders in the development of and use of this standard. Each one of those groups was represented in some way on the Standards Committee and have contributed to the draft as we've carried on. As mentioned before, the overall objective of the standard is to ensure safe, reliable and affordable gas distribution systems. Key to understanding this standard is recognising that they adopt a performance-based approach for the gas distribution management, whereby an acceptable level of risk is to be met through the appropriate application of controls during the life cycle of the gas distribution network. This performance-based approach allows innovation and development in the way gas distribution networks are managed, operated and maintained by specifying safety outcomes while still allowing some flexibility on how these outcomes are delivered. Supporting this performance-based approach are methods known as means of compliance, or means of correction. They're now known as means of conformance, which can be used by a practitioner to achieve an acceptable level of risk where the practitioner wants to minimise the effort required to undergo the more complex processes offered through the performance-based approach. These means of conformance are industry-recognised approaches to the control of threats. The standard is based on 6 foundation elements. Firstly, a gas distribution network is designed and constructed to have sufficient control to withstand the threats to which it may be subjected to during its life cycle. Before a gas distribution network is placed into operation, it is inspected and tested to prove its integrity. Important matters relating to safety, engineering design, materials testing and inspection are reviewed, documented, recorded and approved in accordance with the safety and operating plan. Operations and maintenance provide for continued monitoring and safe operation of a gas distribution network. Where changes to a gas distribution network, which alter the design assumptions or affect the original integrity, occur, appropriate steps are to be taken to assess the changes to ensure continued safe, reliable and affordable operation of the gas distribution network. Where means of compliance, alternative to that provided in this standard, to be adopted, a review is undertaken to determine that the alternative is within the acceptable level of risk. In the review of the standard, the committee identified 10 principles which were used or called the revision principles. The review of the standard has been based upon these 10 principles that were agreed at the first meeting of the committee. Where there has been debate, these principles, along with the overall objectives, have provided guidance to decisions that have been made. I'll let you read them in the slide in front of you. As basically identified in Principle 10, the revisions on the standard are based upon industry experience, incidents and knowledge learned from incidents, and research since the last release of the standards in 2008. Again, I'd be pleased to receive any questions on the background, the application of a standard or the revision principles from those on the webinar. I will now move to discuss specifically the proposed amendments to Part 1. In front of you is the table of contents for Part 1. I've highlighted the first 7 sections, being 1 to 7, as they're the ones that have changed the most in the redraft. The slides and bullet points that follow in the next set of slides are generally in the same order as they appear in the draft to help you follow if you need to. In some of the slides I've highlighted in blue text the key items, and these are generally the items that the committee also would like to draw your attention to and where you may wish to concentrate any of your public comments. Firstly, a couple of general items. At a general level, there have been several changes which we draw your attention to. The first change on the slide is a simple yet important change. Recognising that any distribution system needs to be affordable to exist, though this must not be at the expense of safety and reliability. The second item I've already stumbled over once already, and that is we've moved the terminology of means of compliance to means of conformance. This has been to reflect a request from Standards Australia as they identify compliance as related to regulatory instruments and conformance as related to standards. Thirdly, the committee have been more conscientious in any external referencing we have undertaken, particularly where the scope of reference may not be appropriate. An example of this is the standard previously referenced large parts of the Australian Standard 5601. However, on reflection, 5601 is limited to pressure generally of 200 kPa and downstream of customers' meters assemblies, and therefore we are referencing a standard where the scope wasn't the same as our own. In terms of Section 1 scope, there have been several changes in this section, though most of them are of a minor nature. Reflecting some overseas and recent Australian proposals, we have actually identified a limit for the hydrogen content of 15%. Next piece you'll note is where I've called out the blue points, which are the ones there. Whoops, excuse me. The blue points, clarification and definitions. I encourage LP gas stakeholders to carefully review these changes. We have attempted to clarify where an LP gas system starts and finishes. I also encourage everyone to review the definitions as you work through the standards. Several of the definitions have changed and their use in the standard has changed. As noted at the last bullet point, Appendix A is still in play. Again, if there are any questions on general items or scope, please ensure they come towards us. The next two slides are on Section 2, Network Safety. The committee has concentrated in this section on reinforcing the existing concepts, especially around the section around Formal Safety Assessment, or FSA. The FSA is fundamental to the standard. Of note now are several items. Firstly, Appendix B, which was originally informative, has now been moved to a normative appendix. This was foreshadowed at the last review of the standard, where it was decided without any industry experience with it, it should be informative. Following now the experience since 2008, it has been moved to normative, though there have been several modifications to the appendix. We've also provided more clarity on the validation of the FSA and recognised the difference between an issue-specific FSA and a general FSA. Additionally, an FSA checklist has been provided for guidance. Within this section, there's also been some reordering and some editorial work done on those sections in front of you: safety and operating plans, competency of personnel, and records management. The other change is we have moved the section on means of conformance forward into here, whereas previously it was repeated heavily throughout the whole standard. Again, we'd call for any questions on network safety, especially around that section on the formal safety assessment, which is critical to the underpinning of the rest of the sections within the standard. Section 3, planning. Within planning, there have been several minor editorial changes and the introduction of a new section. There have been editorial changes around the general words. We've actually consolidated some of the information on gas specification from elsewhere in the standard. And a new section has been introduced called Upgrading of MAOP. This section provides guidelines and requirements for the increase of pressure into a section of or an asset related to the gas distribution network. It's largely based on some work done out of our New Zealand committee members and their experience in undertaking similar type operations. The next two slides are based around Section 4, Network Design. The material area in this section has been enhanced through several changes and rearrangement of previous sections. Recognising the widespread use of copper, the committee has also introduced a substantive set of requirements and guidance related to the use of copper. Appendix F, though remaining informative, has been enhanced with a lot more guidance on how one may go about selection and application of materials. And additionally, the network pressure control section, which used to refer largely to an appendix, has been brought together. So the appendix has been removed, and all that information that was in there has now been consolidated into the main body of the standard. One of the areas of focus has been network infrastructure associated with buildings, either in close proximity or inside buildings. To this end, there has been both new and modified information or requirements, adding the reflecting this focus. The standard is now more self-contained, with many of the previous references to AS4601 removed and replaced with substantive information better related to gas distribution networks. This has been a key focus area for the committee, and we appreciate your input via public comment on these changes. Construction, testing and commissioning, Section 5. Improvements to Section 5 reflect latest industry experience and techniques. The section on purging and flaring provides additional safety guidance compared to the last revision. This reflects industry research, again primarily by our Western Australian colleagues. It also reflects the strong commitment of the committee to safety of both the public, our employees and contractors. As with any of the sections that are new, I really draw your attention to them and request you read them carefully and provide appropriate public comment. Section 6, Operations. Key changes in Section 6, Operations, are generally related to leakage management as reflected by the enhancement to requirements concerning odorant. Odorant is a key control, and it's noting this, there has been extra guidance added. Appendix D, which classifies the classification of leaks, has also been enhanced to reflect the difference between natural gas and LPG gas. And this has been led to changes in proposed mechanisms for leakage surveys for LP gas. Additionally, within leakage management, there's been an emphasis on adding some information as to the methodology, not just the frequency in which leakage surveys are undertaken. Section 7, Maintenance and Repair. Though there has been several editorial changes within this section, the majority of it has stayed unchanged. However, an area of continued discussion across the industry is the potential long-term effects of squeezing off plastic pipes. The committee has had long and robust debate on this item. The committee has sought to reflect this debate but would appreciate feedback to the approach used in the draft of the standard. Again, we'd seek any questions on the construction, maintenance and operations sections, especially feedback on any of those sections where there has been substantive change or new requirements or information introduced. The remaining sections, section 8 through 10, have only had minimal amendments, all of which are primarily editorial. The decommission section, section 8, has had some minor editorial changes. Section 9, emergency response and incident investigation, has had again some minor editorial changes, including the use of the term significant incidents replacing just the term incidents. Section 10, performance monitoring, again has only had minor editorial changes. However, the committee is cognizant that the last sections may not get the emphasis on as do the earlier sections, especially as the committee tends to lose momentum as it works through the standard. So please consider carefully any of your public comments that may be relevant to these sections. In effect, I've rushed through fairly quickly the changes that we've made within the standard. Again, I draw you to the table of contents where most of the changes have occurred in sections 2 and sections 4, with other sections getting changed with very little change. 2 and sections 4, with other sections getting changed with very little change in sections 8, 9 and 10. I again reinforce the administrative points that public comment closes on the 26th of April, and we encourage strongly public comment on the standard. And following the links on the Standards Australia webpage will get you to the process for that. There is some time now for questions, which if people wish to type in, I can work through. Again, the only questions I will probably attempt to answer are questions on clarification or on the process with Standards Australia. Are there any questions via the webinar? So there's one question from Robert. Some time ago, customer was changed to consumer to reflect the changing regulatory environment. Yes, the committee did debate this several times. It would be, we would welcome comments on that. It was decided that in most jurisdictions, people reflected that networks supplied consumers, not customers. There was not consensus across the committee, but it was decided to leave it as it is. A question from Anthony. Is it preferred comments to be provided per company? Collate them to the committee. That would be preferable. It would be preferable and probably easier for everyone if those within the same organisation actually collated their comments and brought them through that way. Yes, there's a question from someone relating to, can we access the materials of his presentation? Having issues seeing the slideshow. Yes, the presentation will be made available through the NA website at some stage in the near future. We're just working through the best mechanism for how that will occur. There's a question from Chris, can you provide some background to the changes in leak management methodology? Chris, I'll take that offline and I'll send you something on that when I get your contact details. It's probably easier. There's a moderate amount of just effectively adding some methodology, whereas before we just had frequency. From Susan, can you please describe conformance versus compliance again? Yes, so the previous version or the current version of the standard talks about means of compliance, which are a means by which effectively a prescribed process can be used. So, for example, depth of cover, if you use the depth of cover stated in the means of compliance in either Part 2 or Part 3, you can you do not need to necessarily risk assess those in isolation. What Standards has asked is that we change the word compliance to conformance. They see compliance as relating to legislative requirements, whereas conformance they're happy with relates to standards. So it's really a nomenclature issue, that change, more than anything else. Trevor has asked, how are comments addressed and are they responded back to the author? Comments are addressed, so the public comments are addressed by the committee. So all the public comments are actually collated by Standards Australia and provided back through the committee. I would need to check with Standards Australia what the process of responding back to the authors are. I think in some cases we have previously gone back to ask for clarification around the questions. Depending again on the number of comments we get, I think depends on, and the style of comments depends on how that interaction works. Trevor, I will ask Standards Australia what the current process is in response to that. Chris has asked a question about applicability to existing assets and retrospectivity. Standards policy on retrospectivity is they're effectively silent on it. What we have said in the forward, I think it is of standard, is the standard may be applied to existing assets and its application would be relevant in many cases to existing assets, but we have been, in accordance with standards policy, relatively silent on the retrospectivity, which means it's generally led to the regulatory environment to make those decisions, rather than just to the standard itself. There's a question on, can we view other people's comments? No, the comments effectively come to the committee and they're held by the committee. The only time there may be some sharing is if we're trying to determine whether two comments are the same thing but are written slightly differently. Looks like a comment from across the ditch. Are we going to discuss any of the appendices? I wasn't going to go into the appendices in essence, other than from the sections where they pointed to, as I have. I do encourage people to look at the appendices. The appendices are a bit like the last bits of a standard. They sometimes get forgotten, but especially those normative appendices contain requirements that, as if are in the main body of the standard. And there is a reasonable amount of information in some of those appendices. In fact, I think we're up to Appendix O now, so of which about 50% of them would be normative. I think we've dried up from questions, so I thank you all for coming online and hearing about the standard. I would strongly encourage everyone to make public comments. The committee probably would not like to have 50,000 comments, but I think it's really good to have robust, good, constructive comments. What I'd ask in your comments is that don't just put a general statement. Please put what you'd expect to be the words, the change to the words. So show markup of the words you wish to be changed. It's very hard for the committee to go and change things based on a general approach. Again, thank you very much to E&A for taking the time and effort to put on the webinar. I think it's worthwhile for all of us to understand what's going on from a standards update. So thank you.